Some cars from the 1950s were so brutal that they literally redefined what it meant to be dangerous on four wheels. And this is absolutely true. From engines that would explode without warning to suspension systems that turned every pothole into a launching pad. In this video, we'll discover the 12 most savage, forgotten, and terrifyingly engineered automobiles from the 1950s that manufacturers desperately want erased from history books. 1959, Cadillac Eldorado Beeritz. Picture this. It's 1959, and Cadillac decides to build a car so outrageously oversized that it makes modern SUVs look like golf carts. The Eldorado Beeritz was automotive excess wrapped in 19 feet of chrome-plated insanity. This beast weighed 5,060 pounds and stretched longer than some city buses. But here's where physics started laughing. Those massive tail fins weren't just for show. They were actually functional spoilers designed to keep the rear end planted at high speeds. The problem? At anything above 70 mph, crosswinds would grab those fins like sails, literally steering the car sideways. Drivers reported feeling like they were piloting a yacht in a hurricane. The brakes were the real nightmare. Cadillac equipped this land yacht with drum brakes designed for cars half its weight. Emergency stops from highway speeds required the length of a football field. One automotive journalist described stopping the Beeritz as like trying to anchor the Queen Mary with a fishing line. The power steering was so overboosted that you could literally steer with one finger. That sounds convenient until you realize that every tiny input would send 5,000 pounds of steel careening across lanes. Highway hypnosis became highway terror as drivers would unconsciously overcorrect, sending the Eldorado into violent tank slapper oscillations. Winter driving was pure Russian roulette. The rear heavy weight distribution meant the front end would float over snow like a hovercraft. Combined with bias-ply tires that had the grip of hockey pucks, the Beeritz would slide sideways down gentle hills that wouldn't challenge a shopping cart. Insurance companies quickly learned to fear the Eldorado. Claims for lost control incidents spiked dramatically. One insurance executive privately admitted they started charging Eldorado owners the same rates as motorcycle riders. Not because they were reckless, but because the car was inherently uncontrollable. Production numbers were kept deliberately low, not for exclusivity, but because Cadillac couldn't afford the liability. The Eldorado Beeritz proved that sometimes bigger definitely isn't better, especially when bigger means more dangerous. 1957 Chrysler 300C. In 1957, Chrysler engineers looked at their 300B and decided it needed more power. Much more power. The result was the 300C, a 375 horsepower monster that made most race cars look tame. What they forgot to upgrade was everything else. The 300C came with a 392 cubic inch Hemi V8 that produced torque figures that would make modern muscle cars weep. But here's the catch. It was still riding on a suspension system designed for gentle Sunday drives. The leaf springs in the rear were so soft that hard acceleration would literally lift the front wheels off the ground. Drivers called it the wheelie machine, and that wasn't a compliment. The manual transmission was a 4-speed unit borrowed from trucks. It was strong enough to handle the power, but the shifter had throws so long you needed a road map to find second gear. Racing drivers reported missing shifts and accidentally finding neutral at 6,000 RPM, causing engine damage that would grenade the entire power plant. But the real terror was the fuel system. The 300C used a mechanical fuel pump that couldn't keep up with the engine's appetite at full throttle. Above 5,000 RPM, the engine would lean out and start detonating. The resulting knock would destroy pistons, connecting rods, and sometimes the entire block. Owners learned to never use full throttle for more than a few seconds. The cooling system was equally inadequate. The radiator was sized for the base model engines, not the fire-breathing Hemi. Summer traffic jams became death sentences as temperatures would soar past 250 degrees. The aluminum heads would warp, the gaskets would fail, and the engine would seize up solid. Chrysler's solution was typical of the era. They blamed the owners. Service bulletins warned against excessive use of full throttle and spirited driving. Essentially, they built a race car and told customers not to use its performance. The 300C's reputation for self-destruction was so well known that Chrysler dealers started refusing warranty claims. One dealer in Detroit reportedly told customers that buying a 300C was like purchasing a very expensive hand grenade with a leather interior. Production lasted just 1 year. Chrysler claimed it was planned obsolescence, but insiders knew the truth. Too many engines were exploding. 1955 Chevrolet Corvette. The 1955 Corvette was supposed to be America's answer to European sports cars. Instead, it became America's answer to the question, how do you kill sports car enthusiasts? Chevrolet took their revolutionary fiberglass body and mated it to a chassis that was fundamentally flawed from conception. The frame was borrowed from the sedan line, which meant it flexed like a wet noodle under cornering loads. The fiberglass body would actually separate from the frame during hard turns, creating gaps you could stick your fingers through. One owner reported that his passenger door wouldn't close after a spirited drive because the body had twisted so much. The original Blue Flame inline-six engine was a joke. It produced 150 horsepower, barely enough to move the Corvette's 2,900 pounds with any authority. But when Chevrolet introduced the optional V8, they forgot to upgrade the rest of the drivetrain. The Powerglide automatic transmission would slip under full throttle, creating a horrifying scenario where the engine would rev to redline with no forward motion. The suspension was agricultural at best. Solid rear axle with leaf springs meant that hitting a bump mid-corner would send the rear end sideways without warning. The front suspension used kingpins instead of modern ball joints, which would wear out after just 10,000 miles, causing a violent shimmy that would tear the steering wheel from your hands. But the most dangerous aspect was the brakes. Four-wheel drums with no power assist meant that stopping required the leg strength of a professional cyclist. The drums would fade after just 2 or 3 hard stops, leaving drivers with a pedal that went to the floor and no stopping power whatsoever. The electrical system was a nightmare of poor connections and inadequate wiring. Headlights would randomly fail, instrument panels would go dark, and the ignition system would cut out without warning. One owner described driving his Corvette at night as like playing Russian roulette with a 3,000-pound bullet. Chevrolet sold just 700 Corvettes in 1955, and nearly half were returned to dealers with serious problems. The car that was supposed to establish America's sports car credibility instead nearly killed the entire program before its starting. 1958 Edsel Citation. Ford's Edsel division was supposed to revolutionize the automotive industry. Instead, the 1958 Citation revolutionized the concept of automotive disaster. This wasn't just a car that failed in the marketplace. It was a car that actively tried to kill its owners. The Citation came with Ford's new FE Series Big Block V8, a 410 cubic inch monster that produced 345 horsepower. That sounds impressive until you realize it was mounted in a chassis that couldn't handle half that power. The engine mounts were inadequate, causing the entire power plant to shift under acceleration. Drivers reported feeling the engine literally moving around in the engine bay. The transmission was Ford's new Teletouch system, controlled by push buttons mounted in the steering wheel hub. It was space-age technology that worked about as well as you'd expect from 1958. The system would randomly shift into neutral, reverse, or park while driving. One owner in Michigan reported that his Citation suddenly shifted into reverse while doing 45 mph on a country road. The resulting mechanical carnage destroyed the transmission and nearly killed him. The suspension was a nightmare of poor engineering. The torsion bar front suspension would snap without warning, sending the car careening into oncoming traffic. The rear leaf springs were so soft that the car would bottom out over speed bumps, damaging the fuel tank and exhaust system. But the Citation's party trick was its electrical system. Ford used a new 12-volt system that was supposed to be more reliable than the old 6-volt setup. Instead, it created a web of electrical problems that would make a NASA engineer weep. The voltage regulator would randomly fail, overcharging the battery until it exploded. The alternator would burn out, leaving drivers stranded with no electrical power. The fuel system was equally problematic. The mechanical fuel pump would vapor lock in hot weather, causing the engine to stall in traffic. The carburetor was so poorly calibrated that it would flood in cold weather and run lean in hot weather. Owners learned to carry jumper cables, tools, and a prayer. Ford dealers reported that Citation owners were averaging 1 warranty claim per month. The car was so unreliable that Ford quietly discontinued the entire Edsel line after just 3 years. The Citation proved that sometimes innovation and incompetence look exactly the same. 1950 Nash Ambassador. The 1950 Nash Ambassador was supposed to be the future of automotive design. With its aerodynamic bathtub styling and unitized construction, it looked like it had driven straight out of a science fiction movie. Unfortunately, it drove like something from a horror film. Nash's unitized body construction was revolutionary, and revolutionary dangerous. Unlike traditional body-on-frame construction, the Ambassador's body was also its frame. This meant that any collision damage would compromise the entire structure. Minor fender benders would cause the doors to jam permanently. One owner reported that hitting a pothole hard enough caused his dashboard to crack because the entire body flexed. The electrical system was a nightmare of complexity and poor reliability. The Turnpike Cruiser had more electrical accessories than most cars have today. Power everything, from seats to windows to antenna. The 12-volt system couldn't handle the load, causing random failures that would leave drivers stranded. But the most terrifying aspect was the brakes. Four-wheel drums with no power assist meant that stopping the 4,500-pound cruiser from highway speeds required the leg strength of a professional athlete. The drums would fade after just one hard stop, leaving drivers with no stopping power whatsoever. Mercury marketed the Turnpike Cruiser as the car that thinks, but owners quickly learned it thought about killing them. Sales were dismal, and Mercury quietly discontinued the model after just 2 years. The car that was supposed to conquer America's highways instead proved that sometimes the highway conquers you. 1954 Kaiser Darren. The 1954 Kaiser Darren was supposed to be America's answer to European sports cars. With its fiberglass body and unique sliding doors, it looked like it had driven straight out of the future. Unfortunately, it drove like something from a nightmare. Kaiser's attempt at building a sports car created one of the most dangerous automobiles ever to wear American badges. The Darren's most distinctive feature was also its most dangerous. The sliding doors looked cool, but they had a fatal flaw. They would randomly open while driving. The latching mechanism was so poorly designed that hitting a bump would cause the doors to slide open, creating a massive air disturbance that would destabilize the entire car. One owner reported that his passenger door opened while cornering, causing the car to spin off the road. The chassis was borrowed from the Henry J. economy car, which meant it was designed for a vehicle half the Darren's weight and with none of its performance aspirations. The suspension was so soft that the car would bottom out over speed bumps, damaging the fiberglass body and exhaust system. The frame would flex so much under cornering loads that the doors would jam shut, trapping occupants inside. The engine was Kaiser's 161 cubic inch inline six, producing just 90 horsepower. That might sound tame, but the Darren's 2,175-pound weight and poor aerodynamics meant that it would struggle to reach highway speeds. The real danger came when owners tried to extract more performance from the anemic power plant. The engine would overheat, seize, or simply explode under stress. The electrical system was a disaster of poor connections and inadequate wiring. The 6-volt system couldn't handle the demands of the lights, ignition, and accessories simultaneously. Owners learned to drive with minimal electrical load, which meant no headlights, no radio, and no heater. But the Darren's most dangerous feature was its handling. The rear heavy weight distribution and soft suspension meant that the car would snap into oversteer without warning. The steering was so light that drivers would overcorrect, sending the Darren into violent tank slapper oscillations. Kaiser built just 435 Darrens before admitting defeat. The car that was supposed to establish Kaiser's sports car credentials instead nearly killed the entire company. Most surviving examples are in museums where they can't hurt anyone. 1958 Packard Hawk. The 1958 Packard Hawk was supposed to be the last hurrah for America's most prestigious automaker. Instead, it became a fitting epitaph for a company that had forgotten how to build cars safely. The Hawk wasn't just Packard's final sports car, it was their final insult to physics and common sense. The Hawk was based on the Studebaker Golden Hawk, but Packard's engineers decided to make it better by adding a McCulloch supercharger to the already stressed 289 cubic inch V8. The result was 275 horsepower in a chassis that couldn't handle 200. The supercharger would randomly fail, sometimes grenading itself and sending metal shrapnel through the engine bay. One owner reported that his supercharger exploded while driving, puncturing the hood and nearly decapitating him. The The transmission was borrowed from Studebaker, which meant it was designed for much lighter cars with less power. The automatic would slip constantly under full throttle, creating a terrifying scenario where the engine would rev to redline with no forward motion. The heat generated would cause the transmission fluid to boil, filling the interior with toxic fumes. The suspension was a nightmare of poor engineering and inadequate components. The front end used torsion bars that would snap without warning, sending the car careening into oncoming traffic. The rear used leaf springs so soft that the car would bottom out over railroad tracks, damaging the fuel tank and exhaust system. But the Hawk's most dangerous feature was its electrical system. The 12-volt system was so poorly designed that it would randomly fail, sometimes while driving. The alternator would burn out, leaving drivers with no electrical power. The voltage regulator would fail, overcharging the battery until it exploded. One owner in Texas reported that his Hawk's battery exploded while he was driving, filling the interior with acid and nearly blinding him. The brakes were perhaps the most terrifying aspect. Four-wheel drums with no power assist meant that stopping the 3,400-pound Hawk required superhuman effort. The drums would fade after just one hard stop, leaving drivers with no stopping power whatsoever. Packard built just 588 Hawks in 1958 before admitting defeat and closing their doors forever. The car that was supposed to save America's oldest luxury brand instead provided a perfect example of why it deserved to die. 1957 Chrysler New Yorker. The 1957 Chrysler New Yorker was supposed to be the ultimate expression of American automotive luxury. With its space-age styling and revolutionary torsion bar suspension, it looked like it had driven straight out of tomorrow. Unfortunately, it drove like something from hell. Chrysler's engineering hubris created not just a dangerous car, but a four-wheeled apocalypse that redefined automotive terror. The New Yorker came with Chrysler's new 392 cubic-inch Hemi V8, producing 325 horsepower. That was enough power to launch the 4,400-pound sedan like a rocket, but Chrysler forgot to upgrade the rest of the car. The transmission was a two-speed PowerFlight automatic that would slip violently under full throttle, creating a horrifying scenario where the engine would rev to redline while the car barely moved. The revolutionary torsion bar front suspension was supposed to provide superior handling. Instead, it provided superior terror. The torsion bars would snap without warning, sending the car careening into oncoming traffic. The failure was so sudden that drivers had no time to react. One owner in Ohio reported that his torsion bar snapped while doing 65 mph on the interstate, sending his New Yorker into a guardrail. The electrical system was a disaster of biblical proportions. Chrysler used a complex 12-volt system with more wiring than most buildings. The voltage regulator would randomly fail, overcharging the battery until it exploded. The alternator would burn out, leaving drivers stranded with no electrical power. The entire electrical system would randomly shut down while driving, leaving drivers without lights, ignition, or power steering. But the New Yorker's most dangerous feature was its fuel system. The mechanical fuel pump would vapor lock in hot weather, causing the engine to stall in traffic. The carburetor was so poorly calibrated that it would flood in cold weather and run lean in hot weather. The fuel tank was mounted in the most vulnerable position possible, directly behind the rear axle, where any rear-end collision would rupture it. The brakes were the final insult. Four-wheel drums with no power assist meant that stopping the 4,400-pound New Yorker from highway speeds required the leg strength of a professional wrestler. The drums would fade after just one hard stop, leaving drivers with no stopping power whatsoever. Chrysler sold over 100,000 New Yorkers in 1957, making it one of their best-selling luxury cars. Unfortunately, it was also one of their most dangerous. The car that was supposed to represent the pinnacle of American automotive engineering instead represented its nadir. And that's all, folks, auto enthusiasts. These were the 12 most brutal, forgotten, and savagely dangerous automobiles ever to terrorize America's highways in the 1950s, a decade where style trumped safety and horsepower mattered more than survival. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future updates. And here's another video I've specially selected for you. See you next time.